Today, I wanted to share something that takes a bit of a look into what I've been doing with my time from home lately. And I want to focus on something that doesn't get a lot of play, doesn't get a lot of love, doesn't get a lot of focus when scholars, historians, even people who work in museums or public history, the lay public, think about William Seward. We tend to reduce him to things like Seward's Folly in Alaska, the Civil War years, and Lincoln. The friendship with Harriet Tubman, his anti-slavery politics, and the Underground Railroad. You can almost forget, and I'll argue a bit today, that even very good historians tend to have done this. You can almost forget that among the many hats he wore, Seward was also one of the first truly great American global travelers. And I want to talk to you about his final journey in 1870 and 1871, trip around the world that he took in retirement, and also about the book that came out of it, W.H. Seward's Travels Around the World, which was a bestseller in 1873, and a book that I am working on a proposal, hoping eventually for a reprinted series. And I spent a lot of time with this book and thinking about it and the journey and the whole process that went involved in Seward's crafting of it. And I want to share some of those stories with you and make the pitch that you should pick this book up again too. But maybe wait, and hopefully before too long, you'll be able to pick up an actual physical copy in the museum bookstore. You can see the globe upstairs in our Diplomats Gallery here in this picture. And we're looking at it on places Seward actually visits on this journey: Japan, China. And Seward certainly had a life well traveled. If you read any of the descriptions of this talk coming into today, I started those descriptions with this quote. It actually comes from Seward's third volume of his autobiography from the summer of 1872. He has a section, the final chapter in his autobiography, just called Table Talk. And it's almost like a diary every day, just a couple of topics of conversation that he was having with people or wanted to talk about at dinner time. And that summer, he talked about the advice he would give to those looking to follow in his footsteps, coming to Seward for advice on how to travel and see the world. And I've always really enjoyed his advice. So you were going around the world. Don't make the mistake of thinking that that is what you're going for. You do not need to go around it in order to demonstrate that it is round, for you know that before you start. It is to see the world, not merely to make its circuit, that you are going. Study the people, their manners, customs, government, religion, and the characteristics that render them different from your own, which is certainly what Seward thought he was doing when he spent 14 months approaching his, he turned 70 while he's on the road, approaching his later life, making a study, as he put it, of the whole world. And then you can see a picture here of some luggage from the house. So Seward and travels. In 1869, March of 1869, early March of 1869 to be very precise, I want to say March 4th and March 5th, Ulysses S. Grant is inaugurated as the 18th President of the United States, and Seward is out of politics for the first time in quite a while. He'd served as America's 24th Secretary of State under Presidents Lincoln and Johnson, the first Secretary of State to go abroad while holding office. He has a love of travel. Another talk I give is some of Seward's earlier trips in the 1830s when he's a very young man. And actually, you can take one of our live virtual tours from back in March, and Zach goes through some of these journeys by showing you objects that he brought back. Seward had hoped that Grant, with whom he was friendly enough and knew well from the Lincoln and Johnson years, might ask him to stay on for a third term in the State Department. He certainly appeared willing to do this. But Grant wants a clean slate. There's some embitterment from the impeachment scandals in which Grant is involved. Andrew Johnson tries to make him his Secretary of War. And so Grant does not ask Seward to stay, and Seward doesn't even attend the inauguration. Andrew Johnson is so angry at the country and at Grant and at the party that he doesn't even let his cabinet, or nor does he, attend his successor's inauguration. So Seward comes home to Auburn, and as you can see here, I'm quoting, there's a picture of the inauguration, some of the biographers, in fact, two of them, Glyden Van Dusen and John Taylor, in their biographies of Seward, say the exact same thing. Seward dreaded retirement. And in Walter Starr's more recent volume, he writes, Seward himself was lonely at this time, much more cheerful at his office than at home, for the shadow left by the death of a beloved wife and daughter seemed to linger in the house. So what's he going to do during this retirement? He doesn't really want to be sitting at home and remembering. He writes that he made the house in Auburn ready because he expected his retirement to be spent in the company of his wife, Frances, who dies 8 weeks after President Lincoln, and his daughter, Fanny, who dies a year and a half later in November 1866. For Seward, in his older age, what he determined to do, in his own words, was to keep in motion. And he goes on 2 quite sizable and rigorous trips. The first one I'm not going to talk about here today. We can talk about that trip another time. It's a great one. I love to talk about it. It's when Seward sees Alaska for the first time, and then travels down the Pacific coast to Mexico, and then comes back home via the Caribbean. What I want to talk about instead is his final of about 5 significant international trips that he takes in his life. The final one from August of 1870 to October of 1871, where he goes completely around the world in a full circumnavigation of the globe, all about keeping in motion. And as he tells people who come to him later, wanting to make a study and see the world for himself. Seward is a world traveler. Here's his passport. In one of our live tours, Emily Kraft, our director of collections, actually took this out and showed it to you. You can watch that again. He was greeted quite often as a political celebrity. When Seward goes to Alaska, Mexico, the Caribbean, and around the world, it's often with an entourage, local leaders, almost sort of like when Seward's a young man and Lafayette comes to the US and he's given a hero's welcome and is shown the country. And everywhere he goes, local leaders come to greet him. Seward was a young man who does that with Lafayette. He gets that kind of royal treatment everywhere he goes. And we'll talk about today some of the incredible access that he was granted as a result of a political celebrity status. A man who was renowned and revered for his friendship with Abraham Lincoln, his role in emancipation of slaves, and someone who had a big reputation, a true American ambassador. And Seward is a first. There will be many that follow Seward and emulate him, but he is the first American statesman to do anything like this, to go everywhere. And it's a point of pride for many countries to be able to receive him. And so he travels like that. Seward and travels. As I was saying, I think it sort of gets an unfair shake in the scholarship, in the biographies, in the historiographies. Some of the biographers write that it's a shallow book. It has little interest. And indeed, in some pretty sizable biographies, you can see Walters and Glyden Van Duzen's, by the time they are getting to the end, they're 400, 500, 600 pages into their stories. You could write a whole book about this trip. You could write chapters and chapters and chapters. They tend to give it a little less attention. Not passing judgment. There's a lot to cover in Seward's remarkable life. He's involved in so many aspects of American history. But this is incredible, and most of the biographies tend to reduce the trip to 3, 4, 5 pages. And an essay that I recommend you read by J. Sexton, William H. Seward and the World, says that perhaps it's worth revisiting, taking a closer look, taking it more seriously, as Seward certainly did. And I like this quote from Sexton's essay. The posthumous and commercially successful William H. Seward's travels around the world informed its many readers of the era's accelerating processes of global integration. Both an account of Seward's world tour and an affirmation of the nationalist principles he promoted throughout his political career, Travels is a key text in the transnational history of the Civil War era. Seward's travel writing and the speeches constituted an early intervention in what became a protracted discussion concerning how the reunified United States should enter a world entering an era of rapid integration conditioned by imperial power, beginning of an age of globalization. And Seward's a key player in that. And you can see a lot of that early interconnectedness of shipping and commerce and trade and transportation taking root. And Seward comments on it, and comments on quite a bit that we're going to talk about today. So I think a book worthy of a second look. And I've certainly been taking quite a few looks at it. The book itself, you've seen my copy, and here it is opening to chapter 1. It's a lovely edition. We're going to talk about the quality that went into producing it. It's got many illustrations. The one you can see right here, when you open the book, is the very first one. It opens into the gardens at the house at 33 South Street in Auburn. When you come visit us this summer, we hope, you'll be able to see that very globe that you can sort of espy here in this picture, which is still in the gardens today. So this book, as I say, often overlooked by modern scholars and biographers, who again, I'm not blaming, because there is so much to cover in Seward, and you really have to do your due diligence in covering the Civil War years and anti-slavery, debates on immigration, women's rights. This really is a subject of a book in itself. Seward thought this book was vitally important. He retires from Washington in 1869, goes on that first trip, Alaska, Mexico, the Caribbean, comes home in the spring of 1870, essentially steels himself for further travel. He actually initially thinks about going to South America and going sort of a north-south route, maybe going to the poles, and then talks himself out of it because, and people talk him out of it, and they think that might be a bit of a more dangerous journey. Seward was so invested in telling the story of his travels that he actually stops work. When he gets home from this trip in October 1871, he and his son Frederick begin work on a political autobiography, his memoirs. He puts those down and doesn't really pick them up again. He spends the last months of his life, much of 1872, diligently working away on this travels book. You can see the office at the Seward House. He put a lot of work into the book there. And in the summer, he went to Woodside, the family's home at Owasco Lake. There's a picture of that from our archives. And he brought it to the summer house. He expended his last energies. And as people commented, the labors involved in this nearly consumed him. The book was a sort of recounting of the memories of all the places he'd been, and he liked to sprinkle in what he called philosophical ruminations, what he thought it all meant, analyzing and assessing governments, economies, cultures, religion, reaching sometimes for profundity, but sometimes actually achieving it. He expends his last energies to produce an 800-page volume. Seward's a big name, as I say, and he actually, as he's working on this, has interest from a number of publishing houses. He's deluged with offers and contracts, and his family is actually able to make a pretty good deal with the Appleton Company out of New York, who are going to put together a very high-quality volume for him, spending significantly. And we actually have the book plates. They're beautiful in the basement of the museum. 200 illustrations. I'm going to show you some of those today. You've already seen the one of the Seward House Gardens, and a beautiful map feature that comes unfolding out at the back of the book. So they win the bid and spend that year, 1872, sending Seward letters, how excited they are. It's going to be marvelous. We're anticipating great, good sales from this. And unfortunately, Seward never lived to hold a physical copy of this book in his hands. I think he would have been satisfied with the quality of it, and I also dare say that he would have been pleased by how well it sold. What a sensation, a phenomenon it became. It certainly did. It helped that Seward traveled and published his travel narrative at a time when Americans were awakening to the new possibilities of being able to be mobile and be tourists, having more access to travel the United States thanks to things like the Transcontinental Railroad, and those with means and a sense of adventure to take the steamers across the Atlantic and Pacific. Seward said it used to be dangerous to cross the Atlantic Ocean. Now it's a little bit boring how safe it is. Not many Americans are yet capable of this, but a new genre of literature emerges, capturing the public imagination. And Seward's book comes out at the perfect moment to capitalize on that. It comes out shortly after the publication of the Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days. It's a board game based on that book. The letters of William Perry Fogg, who was traveling around the same time Seward was, also goes around the world and sends public letters back to newspapers. They come out in books, as you can see here. Also in 1872, the William Cook Company is founded and begins to package expeditions around the world for people of means. And as Seward says later, you can buy your steam ticket in New York if you want to go through a company, and they'll take care of all the details. You can go around the world, and it's easier than one thinks it will be. There's a great book that I've been reading the last few weeks, another recommendation, Grand Tours and Cook's Tours, and it talks about many of these phenomenon. A lot of the Cook's Company, that Jules Verne, Seward is in here, and the rise of world travel is something that was in the 18th century limited to the extremely privileged, the grand tours, heirs of dynasties and great houses and royals, to something that was attainable to at least the upper class and a growing upper middle class, and a modern outline of what we recognize today as the tourism industry comes into being. So Lynn Wiley, and a great book that you can pick up next time you can go to the library or get it for your device. And Travels really did travel. It sold 60,000 copies in its first run and netted Seward's estates $50,000 in copyright profits. Now, I did the math using an inflation calculator, and that rounds out to a little over $1 million in 2019 dollars in book sales. Seward's country, men and women, snapped up copies of this book, and they were in awe of his trip, as you can see here. His details of foreign culture were incredible, the stuff of dreams and novels, many thought, and the fact that he was a retired Secretary of State, a man of the world who knew many world leaders from his time as secretary, whose reputation preceded him everywhere he went. He got incredible access to places and people that the average tourist using Cooks or going on their own, like Perry, would not have been able to even imagine. Historian George Bancroft, who's a friend of Seward's, writes that the length and breadth of his journey would astonish the psalmist, and he asked in his own writing, when did a man of 70 ever before go around the world? The age of Seward impressed people. A man who was 70 was taking on the risk and the complications, the rigors of travel. That, along with his celebrity and the access, the great writing, really makes this book a true sensation. And sadly, again, Seward does not live to see it. He puts a lot of time and commitment into honing the craft of writing. And Seward wants the book to be artful, to match the higher production value that he's going to get out of Appleton. And as he's working on it in the summer of 1872, he writes about the sort of novelists he admires and in a way is aspiring to copy, Defoe and Swift. The two best novels I know, this is more table talk, are Robinson Crusoe and Gulliver's Travels. They tell their story with such minuteness as to make an indelible impression on the imagination, and yet with such brevity as never to be tedious. The test of their excellence may be found in the fact that they are equally delightful to the comprehension of a child and the intellect of a sage. There's Seward's writing desk back in the Auburn house. And that's exactly what the trick he tries to pull off with Travels, to have it be something that would delight a child or a lay reader, someone who doesn't read for pleasure often, and someone who's intellectual. That's why there's analysis in here. There's sort of an area of adventure to the writing. He wants it to have basically his literary cake and eat it too, something that appeals broadly. And that's the style he wants. There's that map unfolding from the back of the book. There's the map of the trip from the Far East through the Near East. And let's talk about where he goes on this journey. Over about 14 months, he goes 44,000 total miles. That's his estimation of how far he traveled. And he put it in perspective, about 100 miles a day. It wasn't always on the move or making such rapid progress. It helped that he could take railroads, the transcontinental across the United States to get himself started, steamships across the Pacific. I took a mail steamer to Japan, and then an cross-Atlantic, transatlantic steamer home eventually. It helped that there were new canals, the Suez Canal in Egypt, and that countries like India and Japan had just finished construction on major rail services. He's able to make good progress when he's moving. He's not always moving. He'll he'll stay for a while in certain places too, but on average broken down about 100 miles a day. You can see the trip. He goes across the country again. Interesting. In the book, he meets up with President Grant along the way, Leland Stanford, Brigham Young, and he has quite an interesting time just getting across the country. Then a mail steamer to Japan. Southward, he goes China, the Straits of Malacca. He stops in Java, and then he gets into the subcontinent, India, and then back to sea. He travels through Middle East, Egypt, Jerusalem, crossing into the Ottoman Empire, and finally makes his way across Europe, which is still essentially a war zone. The tail end of the War of 1870, or the Franco-Prussian War. Seward sees soldiers, and he crosses into both of the belligerents, France and Germany. And so quite a trip to get back home via England and then New York Harbor in October 1820. Seward endured. This was not easy, despite improvements in the technologies of transportation, internal improvement. Seward himself was a big booster of this in his country, and he felt vindicated seeing how much the world was dancing to his tune and investing in these railroads and these canals and these projects. It was not easy. Seward had not really ever recovered from the terrible injuries he suffered from a carriage accident and the assassination attempts in April 1865. He's essentially lost use of his arms. He needs a servant to help feed him, to prop the cigar, the inevitable cigar, as Fred would call it, into his mouth most nights, and even, as the biographers say, in attending to the ordinary offices of nature. Despite the obstacles, Seward endured. He adapted. When he traveled to places with tropical climates, he practiced nocturnalism. He boasted once to Elizabeth Cady Stanton's husband, Henry, that the entire time he was gone, he only missed one dinner. We know how important dinners were to Seward, and only then because he was under the weather. And most who saw him saw the endurance of this elder statesman traveling in his iconic Panama hat. There's a hat, a colored picture of Seward from Frank Busher. If you want to know more about that, shameless plug, go back and watch our first virtual tour. We talk about the trip of Frank Busher to the United States and the paintings he did for Seward, also General Lee and Sherman. Anyway, Seward, nevertheless, he endured. People who met Seward were amazed. There are a lot of accounts of travelers that Seward meets, or people who were stationed in American diplomatic posts who sort of received Seward at their legations, who will say that Seward his hands are all but useless, his face deeply scarred, physical limitations seem to define him, but his mind remained incredibly sharp. The body was failing him. He had to acquire a wheelchair apparatus. At times he had to be physically carried by a servant who traveled with him, but the mind was sharp. He impressed a traveler by remembering the name and the exact location of every American he met along the way on this journey. To keep his mind sharp, every night before falling asleep, he would work to chronicle the day, capturing his comings and goings, chronicling who he met, and sort of doing a recap and figuring out what it all meant. Plus, he was doing his correspondence. The world was getting smaller, and Seward was able to actually use a telegraph wire to send messages. He's corresponding. And through it all, Seward was aided by a young woman, Olive Risley. He traveled with quite a big party when he left Auburn. It includes his nephew, George Seward, Olive Risley and her sister, Hattie, their father, Hanson. Now, this is a few years after Fanny's death, and Seward's been keeping company with a young woman about Fanny's age, and some say reminiscent of Fanny in some ways. And a large enough party travels together as far as Japan and China. But from then on out, it's Seward, his servant, and the girls alone. Hanson doesn't cross the Pacific with them. Olive is an indispensable companion to Seward, helping him with everything, especially in helping him do this dictation to sort of keep the mind sharp and write down everything they said and did. And you can hear Olive's voice in here as well. After Seward's death, she would see this manuscript through to publication, and in the late 1880s published her own account, ostensibly a children's book, but 300 pages long. Seward would legally adopt Olive in Shanghai, China in November of 1870 as part of this trip. There's a lot of gossip back home that Seward's got these young girls out there. What's the relationship? Is it possibly inappropriate or romantic? He's much, much older than her. And he writes to his family that he's made the decision to adopt her. They write back, they're pleased, they're happy, that this recognizes the important place Olive has in his life. So Olive is a constant along the way. And a deeper unpacking of this book would allow us a deeper unpacking into her story. Now, Seward doesn't give us too much personal detail about the two of them and their relationship, but she's ubiquitous. And you can sort of piece together, page by page, the meaning of Olive's presence. There's certainly an aspect of adventure to the books. The narrative unpacks each leg of the journey in lush detail, provides a vivid accounting the work he's doing at night will pay off. Sights seen, peoples met, conversations had, all against a dazzling kaleidoscope of changing backgrounds. Aspects of adventure, being essentially smuggled into Peking with an armed guard, bribing guards for access to sacred places, getting into temples and monasteries and mosques, climbing the Great Wall of China, peering up at the Himalayas, cutting through tiger-infested jungles. He at one time climbs up an active volcano and sees the power of that in Java. Traveling along the Nile in Egypt, he's able to actually descend into some of the pyramids at Giza and visit the king and queen's chambers in places like that. He writes about seeing in a whole black market of basically tomb robbers who are selling antiquities, pieces of mummy. Doesn't buy any of that, but is traveling at a very interesting and critical moment. And I want to say, the book has plenty of good stuff to it, but it's a deeply flawed book as well. It's sort of marred by Orientalism. Seward is certainly exoticizing the other, especially when he's in Far East or Middle Eastern cultures. There are elements of the new social Darwinism backdrop. Seward looking at different cultures and almost sometimes sort of ranking them, which ones seem more advanced to him, sometimes along very racial lines. There are problematic parts of it, to be sure. The adventure narrative is what helps sell it, but there's some deeper stuff in here as well. Before we get to that, a little more of the sort of maybe the surface level stuff. There's the adventure happening, paired with sometimes bizarre and hard to read in the 21st century elements of the very sensual. Now, Seward's a gentleman, and he's not going to write anything too graphic, but he certainly encounters some things and participates, or at least observes, spectacle. Dance displays in Egyptian palaces. The girls come forward in their short pink and white satin dresses, covered with lace and spangles, and they perform a lengthy dance for him. Hours long, he writes. In India, presented with a harem. They trembled like so many aspens, only gleaming jewels could be seen. In Java, there's a picture from the book, a dancing girl. He's presented a movement of 4 young women, about 18, gliding into the room in harmony, in garb that showed a lot of skin. Sometimes, and there's some inconsistency here, I think Seward felt himself sometimes as a guest in countries. Not criticizing his host was usually a good move, though sometimes he does that. He does sometimes speak out against practices he sees, both from colonial cultures, the colonized and the colonizers. He steps up on behalf of women, though clearly not great that he's seeing some of these shows. When he can, he tries to hold Olive up as an example, an epitome of what a well-educated, progressive woman can do. He argues in the book that this can be the backbone of a great advanced, he's making these value judgments, societies like the United States. And he argues that the degradation and debasement of women excludes women from society, renders her incapable of it. And the benefits, he says, of elevating women to the highest places of society are key to the social good. Their quote here, "Neither horses, cattle, nor women admitted," comes from a Japanese temple where, and Olive, I think, is very present in calling attention to some of the sexist practices of the encounters they have. And they address it, sometimes confrontationally, sometimes in the hindsight of this book. So there's a sort of back and forth thing here, and it may be an ambivalence or a wrestling with what do you see and what do you do when you encounter something like this. He's there to make it study, as he says, but he also will say in the end of the book that he wants to do good as a result of this travel. So it's a complicated book. Parts of it are wonderful and hold up really well, and parts of it are just completely reflective of that moment. And of course, the white male privilege that Seward enjoyed. He is not only having adventures, he's acting as official diplomat. Something of an air of official state business permeates his purpose and his pages. He is given the incredible and theretofore unprecedented honor of meeting the Emperor of Japan, unheard of for Westerners, as he's traveling through a private audience. And from there on, he is granted access to some of the leaders, both colonial leaders and the British and the French, the Dutch empires, but as well as the leaders of Japan, China, who are struggling against the yoke of imperial pressure. The funny story about the Japan is Seward thought he knew the leadership in Japan. In our diplomats gallery, we've got an image of the tycoon, as well as two diplomats who Seward hosts in Washington, D.C. and serves them champagne, and he loves these guys. And he gets to Japan and he wants to know where the tycoon is. Well, he's been deposed. There's a new regime. One of the diplomats is in captivity and one has taken flight and is a refugee. So he has to quickly adjust to this. And he fills dispatches and letters back to Washington. He wants somebody in the State Department to know what he's seeing. What's happening politically? Is there a volatility? What's happening with the imperial powers? What's happening with their economies? And he sends their agriculture, trade potential, all of this he sends back, as well as he's quite often called upon to speechify. So he'll stand up protesting, perhaps too much, that he's there unofficially, he's retired, he holds no role in the US government anymore, but he's a private citizen, but he is seen by many as a true, and in many cases, the first true American statesman to cross these borders. And he's afforded great privileges and something of an official status, even though he's there unofficially. Whether it's as private citizen or not, it does grant him incredible access to people. Here's the Maharaja of Patala, India. He meets pretty much anybody you can think of, and there are diplomats in our gallery from this trip. He's granted access to all sorts of incredible sites. One of the things that, another sort of wrinkle of complication in the travels that comes across is here is Seward, who many see as a father figure in the founding of an American school of imperialism or expansion, whether you consider him a manifest destiny apostle or someone who anticipates the direction of 1890s American imperialists. He's actually got a very critical and nuanced, sophisticated argument. He's not necessarily a fan of the subjugation models deployed by the French, the Dutch, and the English. And he actually, while he's sometimes complimentary, and he's of course hosted by the Viceroy of India, a man who says, we're gonna hold this as long as the sun rises, he attends official events and he recommends Britain should withdraw. He's got critical things to say about misuse of power, oppressive exactions, seizures, and none of it, he says, matches up the Constitution of England. So some really interesting anti-imperialist sentiment, mixed, of course, with the 19th century imperialism and early jingoism that you might expect. But again, much more complicated than one might assume on the surface. The sights he sees, we just saw the Taj Mahal. Here he's seeing the Sphinx, a mosque in Cairo, the Colosseum in Rome, pillars in Akbar's council chamber. This is back in India. Again, there are 200 pictures in this book, and I did my best to capture some interesting ones. And they're really interesting. I found myself wondering, is he traveling with an illustrator? Where is all this coming from? Some of them are signed. So Seward, I'm not going to take you through every leg of the journey. I was really interested in what went into the book, and then sort of looking at what I think it means, giving a brief overview of what's in there, because the work I hope to do will unpack it in greater detail. So Seward goes Japan, meets the emperor, China, walks the wall, visits many cities. He actually considers staying in the Far East for a while. He looks at buying a bungalow in Nagasaki and maybe staying for a while, but they press on, he and his party. From China through, again, the Straits of Malacca, he spends quite a bit of time in Java. It's where he climbs the volcano, and he's, again, hosted again and again these incredible receptions where performances are put on for him. He's marched into many cities and town like a conquering hero, able to travel through Egypt along the Nile, see the Suez Canal, which makes him even more upset that he wasn't able to get a canal himself, through Panama or parts of South America. And then traveling through the Ottoman Empire, a bit precarious, and into Europe, where, as I say, he sees the continent at war. He goes through Germany and France, who were really wrapping up the War of 1870. When you visit us, look for Bismarck, Napoleon III, and Eugenia, Empress of France, in our diplomats gallery. Seward meets Eugenia, Napoleon III's wife, in France. Her husband's been taken prisoner, captured at war, and held by Bismarck and King William of Germany. He sees soldiers in German and French cities. Paris is attacked. So he's seeing a war that is just sort of being cleaned up, in a peace that will cede land to Germany and also lay the seed for the First World War. On to England, where he begins to hear the call of home. This is a picture of the Seward house from the bookplate. He thinks about staying in Europe longer. Winter's coming. He's already been away for 14 months. He has grandchildren at home. Olive Risley's father has been writing, "Would you please bring my daughters back?" And so they leave England in September of 1871, arrive in New York in October, and make for Auburn. When he arrives back home, October 9th, 1871, it is to the last of the many grand receptions that await him on the journey. And he gets out of the train station, and it seems as if the whole city has turned out to welcome Mr. Seward home. He arrives around 9 o'clock at night, and this is a year and a day until his death, October 10th, 1872. And he gives an impromptu speech. He's gotten very good at giving these impromptu speeches. I thought the one he gives in Auburn was very sweet. "My friends, we are," I think I have a typo there. "We are met together, I trust, not, we are meeting together, I trust, not to part again. I've had a long journey, which in its inception seemed to many to be eccentric. I found that at my age and in my condition, rest is rust," a favorite quote of ours, "and nothing remained to prevent rust but to keep in motion." It's keeping in motion business. "I selected the way that would do the least harm, give the least offense, enable me to acquire the most knowledge, and increase the power, if any remained, to do good." Here's the doing good part. "I give you my sincere and heartfelt thanks, and hope tomorrow and on early future days to learn that happiness has been in all your dwellings, and that all the enterprises in which you are engaged have been crowned with success, as I know there will be at all your firesides during the long winter before us. The same affection and friendship which have been the greatest happiness of my life. He would spend the next year trying to put all this into book form. And it's a really, again, an incredible and rarely looked at source of insight into Seward's motivations, what he cared about. And I think as relevant, as important to take account of as any of the other chapters of Seward's life that we talk about at the museum. And I hope in the future to be able to pull more out of this trip. And I hope you'll be able to come see it with us. We haven't been able to travel ourselves, so just like Americans in the 1870s, living vicariously through William Seward.